Bible History Explained: Who Wrote It and Why It Matters. Picture this. You're holding a book that's been read by more people than any other text in human history. A book that has shaped civilizations, toppled empires, and guided billions of souls across millennia. But here's the thing that might surprise you. This book wasn't written by a single person sitting in a quiet room with a quill and parchment. It wasn't even written in a single century. The Bible, this cornerstone of Western civilization, is actually the product of dozens of authors across 15 centuries, multiple continents, and countless cultural upheavals. And the story of how it came to be is far more fascinating than most people realize. Tonight we're diving deep into one of history's greatest mysteries. Not the content of the Bible itself, but the incredible journey of how it was written, who wrote it, and why understanding this process matters more than you might think. Because once you understand the true story behind the Bible's creation, everything changes. Your perspective on history, on literature, on the very foundations of belief itself, it all shifts. Before we proceed, we have a goal of hitting 1,000 subscribers. Help us. Subscribe to our channel and leave a like in this video so we can keep making great videos like this for you. Now, moving on. I'm about to walk you through discoveries that have revolutionized biblical scholarship over the past century. We'll explore cutting-edge research where Israeli scientists are using artificial intelligence to decode ancient texts, revealing secrets that have been hidden for nearly 3,000 years. We'll uncover why traditional beliefs about biblical authorship have been completely overturned by modern evidence. And we'll examine how archaeological discoveries continue to reshape our understanding of these ancient writings. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. Despite being written by multiple authors across vast spans of time and geography, the Bible maintains an internal consistency that has puzzled scholars for generations. How is that possible? What forces were at work behind the scenes? And what does this tell us about the nature of these texts themselves? The answers to these questions don't just matter for theologians and historians. They matter for anyone who wants to understand how ideas spread, how cultures form, and how the written word can transcend time itself. Because the Bible isn't just a religious text, it's a window into human civilization, a mirror of how our ancestors thought, believed, and organized their world. So settle in, because we're about to embark on a journey that will challenge everything you thought you knew about one of the most influential books ever written. And trust me, by the end of this exploration, you'll never look at ancient texts the same way again. Let's start with a revelation that has shaken the academic world to its core. For centuries, people believed that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It was such a fundamental assumption that questioning it seemed almost heretical. But here's the problem. Moses lived in the 2nd millennium BCE, before Hebrew writing even existed. The texts attributed to him were actually written in the 1st millennium BCE, potentially hundreds of years after his death. This isn't just academic hair-splitting. This is a complete reimagining of how these foundational texts came to be. And it gets even more intriguing when you dive into the evidence. A group of Israeli and international scholars recently published groundbreaking research in the journal PLOS One, using computer-assisted analysis to examine the first 9 books of the Hebrew Bible. What they discovered was extraordinary. The texts reflect 3 distinct scribal traditions, each with its own unique style. As Thomas Romer from the Collège de France explained, we found that each group of authors has a different style, surprisingly, even regarding simple and common words such as know, which, or king. Think about that for a moment. Even the most basic words in these ancient texts carry the fingerprints of different authors. It's like discovering that what you thought was a single painting was actually a collaborative masterpiece created by multiple artists across different time periods, each adding their own brushstrokes to the canvas. This research represents a revolution in biblical scholarship. For the first time, we're using the same technological tools that help us understand genetics and evolution to decode ancient religious texts. The implications are staggering. If these texts had multiple authors, then the traditional understanding of biblical composition needs to be completely reconsidered. But this isn't just about ancient history. This discovery forces us to ask deeper questions about the nature of authorship itself. In our modern world, we're obsessed with individual creativity, with the lone genius crafting their masterpiece in isolation. But what if the greatest works of literature were actually collaborative efforts? What if the most profound truths emerged not from single minds, but from communities of thinkers building upon each other's work across generations? The evidence for multiple authorship doesn't stop with computer analysis. Archaeological discoveries have consistently supported this view. We've found that different sections of biblical texts reflect different historical periods, different cultural contexts, and different theological perspectives. It's as if each author was responding to the challenges and questions of their own time while contributing to a larger, ongoing conversation. This brings us to one of the most influential theories in biblical scholarship, the documentary hypothesis. This theory, developed over more than a century of research, proposes that the Torah was compiled from 4 originally independent documents. The Jahwist source, dating to around the 10th century BCE, the Elohist source from the 8th century BCE, and 2 others, each bringing their own perspective and style to the final text. Now, you might be wondering, if this theory has been around for so long, why is it still controversial? The answer lies in the nature of the evidence itself. Unlike other historical documents, biblical texts have been copied and recopied thousands of times over millennia. Each copying introduced the possibility of changes, whether intentional or accidental. Reconstructing the original sources is like trying to solve a puzzle where most of the pieces have been lost or altered. But here's where it gets fascinating. Recent developments in scholarship have seen a resurgence of the documentary hypothesis, but in a more sophisticated form. As new archaeological evidence emerges and new analytical techniques are developed, scholars are finding that the theory explains more about biblical composition than previously thought. It's not just making a comeback, it's being refined and strengthened by modern research. The implications of this research extend far beyond academic circles. If the Bible was written by multiple authors over centuries, then understanding its message requires understanding the historical contexts in which these authors lived. Each contributor was responding to specific challenges, addressing particular audiences, and working within the constraints of their time and culture. Consider what this means for interpretation. A text written during the Babylonian exile would reflect very different concerns than one written during the height of the Davidic kingdom. An author writing for a priestly audience would emphasize different themes than one addressing common people. When we recognize these different voices within the biblical text, we begin to hear a rich symphony of perspectives rather than a single, monolithic message. This understanding also helps explain some of the apparent contradictions and tensions within biblical texts. Rather than seeing these as problems to be solved, we can recognize them as evidence of the complex process by which these texts were created. Different authors, writing in different circumstances, naturally emphasize different aspects of their shared faith and heritage. The process of biblical composition was not unlike the way communities preserve and transmit their most important stories today. Think about how families pass down their histories through generations. Each storyteller adds their own details, emphasizes different aspects, and adapts the story to their audience. Over time, these individual contributions create a rich tapestry of memory and meaning. But the biblical authors weren't just telling stories, they were creating literature. And not just any literature, but texts that would need to serve multiple purposes: historical record, legal code, theological treatise and spiritual guide. The fact that these texts succeeded in all these roles while being created by multiple authors across centuries is nothing short of remarkable. This collaborative nature of biblical authorship also helps explain the text's enduring power. Because it emerged from communities rather than individuals, it reflects the collective wisdom, struggles, and insights of entire cultures. Each author contributed their piece to a larger mosaic, creating something greater than any individual could have achieved alone. The evidence for multiple authorship continues to mount as new discoveries are made. Archaeological findings have revealed the complexity of ancient Israelite society, with different regions, social classes, and religious traditions, all contributing to the cultural milieu in which biblical texts were created. Rather than a uniform, monolithic culture, we see a vibrant, diverse community of thinkers and writers. Recent analysis of ancient manuscripts has also revealed the sophisticated editorial processes that shaped biblical texts. These weren't crude compilations of older sources, but carefully crafted works that integrated multiple traditions into coherent narratives. The editors who assembled these texts were skilled literary artists in their own right, creating works that honored their sources while serving the needs of their own communities. This understanding of biblical composition has profound implications for how we read these texts today. Instead of looking for a single, authoritative interpretation, we can appreciate the multiple layers of meaning that emerge from this complex process of creation. Each reading can reveal new insights, just as each generation of readers brings their own perspective to these ancient words. The story of biblical authorship is ultimately a story about the power of collaboration across time. It shows us how communities can create works of lasting significance by building upon the insights of previous generations. It demonstrates that the most profound truths often emerge not from individual genius, but from the collective wisdom of cultures wrestling with life's deepest questions. As we continue to uncover new evidence about biblical composition, we're not just learning about ancient history, we're discovering timeless truths about how humans create meaning, preserve memory, and transmit wisdom across generations. The Bible's complex authorship doesn't diminish its significance. It reveals the remarkable process by which communities of believers across centuries contributed to one of humanity's most enduring achievements. And this brings us to one of the most remarkable discoveries in modern biblical scholarship, discoveries that would have been impossible just a few decades ago. Because while we've been talking about multiple authors and collaborative writing, there's another layer to this story that's even more fascinating. The biblical texts we have today aren't just the work of their original authors. They're the product of centuries of careful preservation, copying, and transmission by scribes who understood they were handling something precious. Picture this. You're a scribe in ancient Jerusalem, sitting in a scriptorium with a flickering oil lamp, carefully copying sacred texts by hand. Every letter matters. Every word carries weight. You're not just copying, you're participating in an unbroken chain of preservation that stretches back generations and will continue long after you're gone. This was the reality for thousands of scribes across millennia who ensured these texts survived. The New Testament alone has been preserved in more than 5,800 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, and 9,300 manuscripts in various other ancient languages. That's over 25,000 manuscript copies. Compare that to other ancient texts. Homer's Iliad, considered one of the best preserved works of antiquity, exists in fewer than 700 manuscripts. The sheer volume of biblical manuscripts is staggering. But here's where it gets interesting. With so many copies made over so many centuries, you'd expect the text to be corrupted beyond recognition. Ancient scribes didn't have printing presses or photocopiers. They had to copy every single letter by hand, often working in dim light, sometimes from dictation, always under the pressure of preserving something sacred. And yet, when scholars examine these thousands of manuscripts, they find something extraordinary. The textual integrity has been maintained with a remarkable 99.5% accuracy. Let me put that in perspective. Among all those manuscript copies, spanning centuries and continents, the essential message remains intact. The variations that do exist are mostly trivial, differences in spelling, word order, or minor grammatical changes, the kind of variations you'd expect from any copying process, but nothing that changes the fundamental meaning of the text. This level of preservation is unprecedented in ancient literature. It's as if thousands of people across hundreds of years were all working together to protect something they knew was irreplaceable. And in a way, that's exactly what was happening. These weren't just scribes doing a job. They were custodians of civilization's most important texts. The process of textual criticism, the scholarly discipline of examining these manuscripts to reconstruct the original text, has become increasingly sophisticated. Modern scholars use techniques borrowed from genetics, statistics, and computer science to trace the relationships between different manuscript families. They can track how texts spread geographically, how errors were introduced and corrected, and how different communities preserved their particular versions. One of the most significant developments in this field is the use of phylogenetics, the same method biologists use to trace evolutionary relationships between species. Scholars can now create family trees of manuscripts, showing how different copies are related to each other and which ones are most likely to preserve the original readings. It's like DNA analysis for ancient texts, but the preservation of biblical texts involved more than just careful copying. It required a massive coordinated effort across cultures and centuries. Think about the logistics involved. These texts had to be copied in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, and dozens of other languages. Each translation required scholars who understood multiple languages and cultures. Each copy required materials, parchment, ink, time, that were expensive and precious. The fact that this preservation effort succeeded tells us something profound about how these texts were valued. Communities were willing to invest enormous resources to ensure these words survived. They created schools to train scribes, established libraries to house manuscripts, and developed systems to check and verify copies. This wasn't just preservation, it was a civilization-wide commitment to maintaining access to these texts. Archaeological discoveries continue to validate the accuracy of this preservation process. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, scholars were amazed to find that texts copied over 1,000 years earlier were virtually identical to medieval manuscripts. The same careful attention to detail, the same commitment to accuracy, had been maintained across millennia. Consider the Isaiah scroll from Qumran, dating to around 100 BCE. When compared to medieval manuscripts of Isaiah, the differences were minimal. After 1,000 years of copying, the text had remained remarkably stable. This discovery revolutionized our understanding of how biblical texts were transmitted and validated the work of generations of scribes. The preservation process also reveals something fascinating about ancient literary culture. These weren't societies that treated text casually. They understood that written words carried power, that ideas could transcend individual lifetimes, that certain texts were worth preserving at almost any cost. The care taken with biblical manuscripts reflects a deep appreciation for the written word that modern digital culture is only beginning to rediscover. But preservation wasn't just about maintaining the text, it was about maintaining access. Throughout history, biblical texts have been copied not just for storage, but for distribution. Monasteries, synagogues, and churches became centers of literary production, ensuring that these texts reached new communities and new generations. The Bible became one of the first truly global texts, copied and distributed across continents. This global distribution created its own challenges. Different communities had different needs, different languages, different cultural contexts. The process of translation became as important as the process of copying. Scholars had to find ways to convey not just the literal meaning of words, but their cultural and spiritual significance. Each translation was an act of interpretation, a bridge between ancient wisdom and contemporary understanding. The development of the biblical canon, the process by which certain texts were recognized as authoritative, was itself a remarkable achievement in preservation. Early Christian communities had to decide which of the many texts circulating in their time should be considered authentic and authoritative. This wasn't a simple task. It required careful evaluation of each text's origins, its theological consistency, and its acceptance by established communities. The canon of the New Testament took shape over almost 4 centuries. By the third quarter of the 2nd century, leading Christian teachers had identified the 4 Gospels as authoritative. Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 180 CE, defended the position that these 4 Gospels, and only these 4, should be recognized for liturgical and theological purposes. This early consensus laid the foundation for what would become the established biblical canon. The formal recognition came gradually. Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, provided the first complete list of the 27 books of the New Testament in his Easter letter of 367 CE. The Synod of Hippo Regius in North Africa in 393 CE was likely the first council to formally accept this canon. But even these formal declarations were recognizing something that had already been established through centuries of community practice. This process of canonization wasn't just about creating a fixed list of books. It was about preserving the authentic voice of the early Christian movement while excluding texts that communities had determined were inauthentic or problematic. The canon became a protective boundary, ensuring that the essential message would be preserved even as the text spread to new cultures and contexts. The preservation of biblical texts also involved the development of sophisticated systems for checking accuracy. Scribes developed techniques for counting letters, words, and verses to ensure nothing was omitted or added. They created elaborate rules for spacing, formatting, and punctuation. Some communities even developed mystical interpretations of textual details, seeing divine significance in the precise form of the text. Jewish scribes, in particular, developed extraordinary standards for textual accuracy. The Masorets, working between the 6th and 10th centuries CE, created a system of vowel points and accent marks that preserved the traditional pronunciation and interpretation of Hebrew texts. Their work was so meticulous that medieval Hebrew manuscripts show remarkable consistency across different regions and time periods. This attention to textual detail reflected a deep theological conviction. These texts were not just human compositions, but sacred words that deserved the highest level of care. Every letter mattered. Every word carried significance. The preservation process became itself a form of worship, a way of honoring the texts and the communities that had created them. The story of biblical preservation also reveals the resilience of textual traditions. These texts survived the fall of empires, the destruction of libraries, persecution, and cultural upheaval. They were hidden in caves, smuggled across borders, and copied in secret when necessary. The fact that they survived at all is remarkable. The fact that they survived with such textual integrity is nothing short of miraculous. Modern technology continues to enhance our understanding of this preservation process. Digital imaging allows scholars to read texts that were previously illegible. Advanced statistical analysis helps identify the relationships between different manuscript families. Computer modeling can predict how texts might have been transmitted and where gaps in our knowledge might exist. These technological advances don't just help us understand the past. they help us appreciate the magnitude of what ancient scribes accomplished. Without computers, without printing presses, without any of the tools we take for granted, they created a preservation system that maintained textual integrity across millennia. They were the guardians of civilization's most important texts, and their work continues to bear fruit today. The preservation of biblical texts is ultimately a story about the power of human commitment. It shows us what's possible when communities decide that certain ideas, certain words, certain truths are worth preserving at any cost. It demonstrates that the most important aspects of human culture don't survive by accident. They survive because people choose to make them survive. As we continue to study these ancient manuscripts, we're not just learning about textual history. We're discovering the remarkable dedication of countless individuals who understood that some things are too important to lose. Their work created the foundation for everything we know about biblical texts today, and their example reminds us that preservation is not a passive process, but an active commitment that each generation must make anew. This brings us to perhaps the most fascinating aspect of biblical scholarship today, the explosive growth of archaeological evidence that's revolutionizing our understanding of these ancient texts. And I'm not talking about dusty artifacts sitting in museum cases. I'm talking about discoveries that are literally rewriting the history books, forcing scholars to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the biblical world. Picture this. You're an archaeologist working in northern Israel in July 1993. You're excavating at Tel Dan, not expecting to find anything particularly groundbreaking. Just another day of careful digging, sifting through layers of ancient soil, and then your brush uncovers something that makes your heart skip a beat. A stone inscription that mentions the House of David. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but as a historical reference to an actual dynasty. This discovery, known as the Tel Dan Stele, completely transformed biblical archaeology. For decades, skeptical scholars had dismissed King David as a mythical figure, comparing him to King Arthur, perhaps based on a real person but vastly embellished by later storytellers. But here was hard evidence, carved in stone in the 9th century BCE, confirming that David was not only real, but significant enough to be mentioned by Israel's enemies. The implications were staggering. If David was real, then the biblical accounts of the United Monarchy weren't just religious fiction. They were historical records. The inscription didn't just validate one biblical figure. It validated the entire historical framework in which these texts were written. Suddenly, the Bible wasn't just a collection of myths and legends. It was a window into actual ancient history. But the Tel Dan inscription was just the beginning. Archaeological discoveries have been piling up at an unprecedented rate, each one adding new layers to our understanding of the biblical world. We found evidence of cities mentioned in biblical texts, confirmation of ancient trade routes, and artifacts that illuminate daily life in biblical times. The archaeological record is painting a picture of a sophisticated, complex ancient world that aligns remarkably well with biblical descriptions. Consider the discovery of the Pilate Stone in 1961. For years, some scholars questioned whether Pontius Pilate was a historical figure or just a character created by the Gospel writers. Then archaeologists found a limestone inscription at Caesarea Maritima that explicitly mentions Pontius Pilatus, prefect of Judea. Once again, archaeology validated biblical history, confirming that the political figures mentioned in the New Testament were real people operating in real historical contexts. These discoveries matter because they address one of the fundamental questions about biblical texts. Are they historically reliable? And the answer emerging from modern archaeology is a resounding yes, at least in many crucial areas. The Bible has proven to be more historically and archaeologically accurate than any other ancient book. It's been subjected to the most rigorous scientific analysis possible, and it consistently emerges as authentic. But here's where it gets really interesting. Archaeological evidence doesn't just confirm individual facts, It reveals the cultural sophistication of the societies that produced biblical texts. Recent excavations have uncovered elaborate water systems, complex administrative structures, and evidence of widespread literacy. These weren't primitive, backward societies stumbling through history. They were sophisticated civilizations capable of producing complex literature. The discovery of ancient libraries and scribal schools has been particularly revealing. At sites like Qumran, archaeologists have found evidence of extensive literary activity. Scribes weren't just copying texts, they were creating them, editing them, and preserving them with remarkable care. The physical evidence supports what textual analysis had already suggested. Biblical texts emerged from literate, sophisticated communities with deep literary traditions. Archaeological evidence has also shed light on the historical context in which biblical texts were written. We can now trace the rise and fall of ancient kingdoms, understand the impact of foreign invasions, and see how different historical periods shape the concerns and perspectives of biblical authors. When we read about the Babylonian exile, we're not just reading about a theological concept, we're reading about a historical trauma that shaped an entire generation of writers. The integration of archaeological and textual evidence has created a new field of study that's transforming biblical scholarship. Scholars can now place biblical texts in their proper historical contexts, understanding not just what they say, but why they were written and how they would have been understood by their original audiences. This contextual understanding enriches our reading of these texts immeasurably. Consider how archaeological evidence has illuminated the composition of the Book of Daniel. Traditional scholarship dated this book to the 6th century BCE during the Babylonian exile. But archaeological evidence about the historical periods described in Daniel suggested a later date. When scholars re-examined the text with this archaeological context in mind, they discovered that Daniel was likely written during the Maccabean revolt in the 2nd century BCE, using the exile as a historical backdrop to address contemporary concerns. This kind of archaeological dating doesn't diminish the text's significance, it enhances it. Understanding when and why Daniel was written helps us appreciate the courage of its authors and the relevance of its message to their immediate audience. The text becomes more, not less, meaningful when we understand its historical context. Archaeological evidence has also revealed the complex process by which biblical texts were transmitted and preserved. Excavations at sites like Qumran have uncovered entire libraries of ancient manuscripts, showing us how texts were copied, stored, and studied. We can see evidence of different scribal traditions, different editorial practices, and different approaches to textual preservation. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered between 1947 and 1956, represent one of the most significant archaeological finds in biblical scholarship. These manuscripts, dating from the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE, provide a window into the textual world of ancient Judaism. They show us how biblical texts were understood and interpreted in the centuries before and during the time of Jesus. What's remarkable about the Dead Sea Scrolls is how they validate the accuracy of later manuscript traditions. When scholars compared these ancient texts with medieval manuscripts, they found extraordinary consistency. The same careful attention to textual accuracy that we see in later periods was already established in ancient times. The scrolls prove that biblical texts were being preserved with meticulous care long before the development of formal scribal schools. But the archaeological evidence goes beyond manuscript preservation to illuminate the world in which these texts were written. Excavations have revealed the material culture of ancient Israel, the tools people used, the houses they lived in, the food they ate. This physical evidence brings biblical texts to life, helping us understand not just what people believed, but how they lived. Recent discoveries have been particularly revealing about the religious practices of ancient Israel. Archaeological evidence shows a complex religious landscape, with different communities practicing different forms of worship. Rather than a monolithic religious system, we see diversity and development over time. This archaeological context helps explain some of the tensions and developments we see in biblical texts. The integration of archaeological and textual evidence has also revealed the sophisticated editorial processes that shaped biblical texts. We can now see how different traditions were combined, how texts were updated for new audiences, and how scribes worked to create coherent narratives from diverse sources. The archaeological record shows us that biblical authors weren't just storytellers, they were skilled editors and literary artists. Modern archaeological techniques continue to enhance our understanding of biblical texts. Ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, and advanced dating methods allow archaeologists to uncover evidence that previous generations could never have accessed. Digital archaeology is creating three-dimensional models of ancient sites, allowing scholars to reconstruct the physical environments in which biblical texts were written. The relationship between archaeology and biblical studies has evolved significantly over the past century. Early biblical archaeologists often approach their work with the explicit goal of proving the Bible true. Modern archaeologists take a more nuanced approach, using archaeological evidence to understand the complex historical contexts in which biblical texts emerged. This shift has produced more sophisticated and ultimately more convincing support for biblical reliability. Archaeological evidence has also revealed the international connections of ancient Israel. Far from being an isolated backwater society, ancient Israel was connected to trade networks that stretched across the ancient Near East. Biblical texts reflect this cosmopolitan environment, showing awareness of foreign cultures, languages, and ideas. The archaeological record confirms that biblical authors were writing from within a sophisticated, internationally connected civilization. The cumulative effect of archaeological discoveries has been to validate the historical reliability of biblical texts while revealing the complexity of the world in which they were written. We can now read these texts with confidence that they emerge from real historical contexts, written by real people dealing with real challenges. The archaeological record doesn't just support biblical history, it enriches our understanding of it. But perhaps most importantly, archaeological evidence has shown us that biblical texts weren't written in a vacuum. They emerged from living communities, addressing real concerns and reflecting actual historical experiences. The physical evidence of ancient life, the pottery, the buildings, the tools, reminds us that these texts were created by people who lived, worked, and worshipped in the real world. This archaeological context transforms how we read biblical texts. Instead of seeing them as abstract theological documents, we can appreciate them as products of specific historical moments, created by real people responding to real challenges. The archaeological record provides the stage on which biblical drama was performed, and understanding that stage enhances our appreciation of the performance. The ongoing dialogue between archaeology and biblical studies continues to produce new insights. As new sites are excavated and new techniques are developed, our understanding of the biblical world continues to evolve. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, creating an increasingly detailed picture of the ancient world that produced these remarkable texts. The story of biblical archaeology is ultimately a story about the persistence of truth. Despite the passage of millennia, despite the destruction of cities and the fall of empires, the physical evidence of ancient life continues to emerge from the ground. This evidence doesn't just confirm biblical accounts, it illuminates them, providing the historical context necessary for full understanding. Archaeological evidence has transformed biblical scholarship from a purely literary discipline into a historical science. We can now study biblical texts not just as documents, but as products of specific historical moments, created by real people living in real places. This historical grounding doesn't diminish the spiritual significance of these texts. It enhances it by showing us the real human experiences that shape their creation. The marriage of archaeology and biblical studies has created a new kind of scholarship, one that honors both the spiritual significance of these texts and their historical authenticity. We can now read the Bible with confidence that we're engaging with genuine historical documents created by real people, reflecting actual historical experiences. The archaeological record provides the foundation for this confidence, validating the historical reliability of texts that have shaped human civilization. As we continue to uncover new archaeological evidence, we're not just learning about the past. We're discovering the remarkable process by which human communities preserve and transmit their most important truths. The archaeological record shows us that biblical texts emerged from societies that valued literacy, treasured their traditions, and worked tirelessly to preserve their heritage for future generations. Their success in this endeavor is validated by every archaeological discovery that confirms the accuracy of their historical records. The transformation of biblical scholarship through archaeological discovery represents one of the great intellectual achievements of the modern era. We've moved from speculation to knowledge, from assumption to evidence, from faith to fact, not abandoning faith, but grounding it in historical reality. The archaeological record provides the solid foundation on which all other biblical studies now rest. But the story doesn't end with archaeological confirmation, because while we've been talking about the historical reliability of biblical texts, there's another question that's equally important. How did these texts gain their authority? How did they become not just historical documents, but sacred scripture? The answer to that question takes us into the fascinating world of canon formation, the process by which certain texts were recognized as authoritative while others were excluded. Picture a room filled with early Christian leaders in the 3rd century, debating intensely over which texts should be considered sacred scripture. They're not just discussing theological preferences, they're making decisions that will shape the faith of billions for millennia to come. On the table before them are dozens of texts, gospels, letters, apocalyptic writings, some claiming apostolic authorship, others clearly written by later communities. The stakes couldn't be higher. Choose correctly, and they preserve authentic apostolic teaching. Choose wrongly, and they risk corrupting the faith forever. This process of canon formation represents one of the most crucial developments in biblical history, yet it's also one of the most misunderstood. Most people assume the biblical canon was established by divine decree or emerged naturally from obvious choices. The reality is far more complex and fascinating. The development of the biblical canon was a gradual, sometimes contentious process that unfolded over centuries, involving careful evaluation, heated debate, and profound theological reflection. The process began in the 1st century with the creation of accounts of Jesus' words and deeds, along with correspondence from early Christian leaders to congregations scattered across the Mediterranean. These weren't written as scripture initially. They were practical documents addressing specific situations and communities. The Gospel of Mark, for instance, was likely written to preserve Peter's testimony for the Roman Church. Paul's letters were responses to particular problems in specific congregations. But something remarkable happened as these texts circulated. Communities began to recognize in them an authority that transcended their original purposes. They found that these writings accurately preserved apostolic teaching, that they spoke with power to situations far beyond their original contexts, and that they provided reliable guidance for Christian faith and practice. The process of canonization wasn't imposed from above. It emerged from below, from the collective recognition of Christian communities. By the 2nd century, certain texts had achieved widespread acceptance. The 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were already being treated as authoritative in most Christian communities. Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 180 CE, defended the position that these 4 Gospels, and only these 4, should be recognized for liturgical and theological purposes. His argument wasn't based on church hierarchy, but on the text's apostolic origins and their acceptance by established Christian communities. The process of recognizing authoritative texts involved several criteria. First, apostolic origin. Texts had to be written by apostles or their close associates. Second, Catholic acceptance. They had to be widely accepted by Christian communities across different regions. Third, liturgical use. They had to prove their value in worship and instruction. Fourth, theological consistency. They had to align with the core apostolic message about Jesus Christ. These criteria weren't applied mechanically, but through a complex process of community discernment. Local churches compared notes, traveling teachers shared their experiences, and gradually consensus emerged about which texts carried apostolic authority. The process was organic, emerging from the lived experience of Christian communities rather than from scholarly analysis or ecclesiastical decree. The formation of the New Testament canon accelerated in response to challenges. When heretical teachers like Marcion created their own selective canons, Orthodox communities felt compelled to articulate more clearly which texts they considered authentic. When persecution threatened to destroy Christian literature, communities needed to know which texts were worth dying for. External pressures forced internal clarification. Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, provided the first complete list of the 27 books that form the modern New Testament in his Easter letter of 367 CE. But even this formal declaration was recognizing something that had already been established through centuries of community practice. The Synod of Hippo Regius in North Africa in 393 CE was likely the first council to formally accept this canon, but they were ratifying decisions that had been made collectively by Christian communities over generations. The process wasn't always smooth or unanimous. Different regions sometimes favored different texts. The Syrian church was reluctant to accept the Book of Revelation, while some Western churches questioned the letter to the Hebrews. These regional variations reflected different theological emphases and cultural contexts. The final canon represented a compromise that honored the diverse traditions within early Christianity while maintaining essential unity. What's remarkable about this process is how it balanced authority with authenticity. The canon wasn't created by powerful individuals imposing their preferences, but emerged from the collective wisdom of communities testing these texts against their experience of Christian faith. The texts that survived this process had proven their worth through centuries of use in worship, instruction, and spiritual formation. The criteria for canonization reveals sophisticated theological thinking. Early Christians understood that authentic apostolic teaching would demonstrate certain characteristics: consistency with the historical Jesus, power to transform lives, ability to build up communities, and alignment with the core gospel message. Texts that met these criteria gradually gained recognition as authoritative scripture. The process also involved careful attention to textual authenticity. Early Christians were aware that false texts were circulating, claiming apostolic authorship. They developed techniques for evaluating the genuineness of texts, considering factors like writing style, historical accuracy, and theological content. This wasn't naive acceptance, but careful scholarly evaluation. The exclusion of certain texts from the canon is as significant as the inclusion of others. The Gospel of Thomas, popular in some regions, was excluded because its theology didn't align with apostolic teaching. The Didache, valuable for its practical instruction, wasn't included because it lacked apostolic authorship. These exclusions weren't arbitrary, but reflected careful theological evaluation. The canonical process also reveals the international character of early Christianity. Texts had to gain acceptance across different cultures, languages, and regions to achieve canonical status. This cross-cultural validation provided additional confidence that these texts carried universal rather than merely local authority. The canon emerged from the global Christian community, not from any single cultural tradition. The formation of the biblical canon wasn't just about creating a closed list of books. It was about preserving the authentic apostolic message while excluding corruptions. The canon became a protective boundary, ensuring that the essential Christian message would be preserved even as the faith spread to new cultures and contexts. It provided a standard against which all subsequent teaching could be measured. This process of canonization had profound implications for how biblical texts were understood and used. Once recognized as canonical, these texts gained authority not just as historical documents, but as divine revelation. They became the standard for Christian faith and practice, the foundation for theology, and the source of spiritual guidance for believers. The canonical process also established principles that continue to influence biblical interpretation. The recognition that these texts emerged from specific historical contexts while carrying universal significance created a framework for understanding how ancient texts speak to contemporary situations. The canon preserved both the historical particularity and the universal relevance of apostolic teaching. Modern scholarship has deepened our understanding of the canonical process without undermining its significance. We now recognize that canonization involved human judgment and historical circumstances, but this doesn't diminish the authority of canonical texts. Instead, it helps us appreciate the careful process by which early Christian communities discerned authentic apostolic teaching. The study of canon formation also reveals the remarkable consistency of early Christian communities across different regions and cultures. Despite variations in practice and emphasis, there was broad agreement about which texts carried apostolic authority. This consistency suggests that the canonical process was guided by shared convictions about the nature of authentic Christian teaching. The biblical canon that emerged from this process has proven remarkably stable over time. While different Christian traditions have minor variations in their Old Testament canons, there's been virtual unanimity about the New Testament canon since the 4th century. This stability suggests that the canonical process successfully identified texts with enduring authority and relevance. Wow. Understanding the canonical process helps us appreciate the human dimensions of biblical authority. These texts didn't become authoritative through magical transformation, but through careful evaluation by communities of believers. The canon represents the collective wisdom of early Christianity about which texts most faithfully preserved apostolic teaching. The process also demonstrates the importance of community in biblical interpretation. The canon emerged from communal discernment, not individual insight. This communal dimension continues to be important for biblical interpretation, reminding us that these texts speak most clearly when read within the context of believing communities. Canon formation reveals the dynamic relationship between text and community. The texts shape the communities that read them, but the communities also shape the texts through their processes of selection, interpretation, and transmission. This dynamic relationship continues today as new generations of readers encounter these ancient texts. The canonical process also established the principle that biblical authority is both historical and spiritual. These texts carry authority because they preserve authentic apostolic teaching and because they continue to speak with power to contemporary situations. The canon bridges the gap between ancient revelation and contemporary faith. Modern challenges to biblical authority often misunderstand the canonical process. Critics sometimes assume that human involvement in canon formation undermines biblical authority. But the canonical process actually demonstrates the careful way early Christians approached questions of textual authority. They didn't accept texts uncritically, but evaluated them rigorously against multiple criteria. The formation of the biblical canon represents one of the most significant intellectual achievements in human history. Early Christian communities developed sophisticated criteria for evaluating religious texts, created processes for building consensus, across diverse cultures and established standards that have endured for centuries. The canon they created continues to shape billions of lives today. Understanding canon formation also helps us appreciate the remarkable achievement of biblical preservation. The texts that survived the canonical process weren't just copied and transmitted, they were treasured, studied, and lived. The canon created a framework for preservation that has maintained these texts across millennia. The canonical process ultimately reveals the profound respect early Christians had for apostolic teaching. They understood that the message of Jesus Christ was too important to be corrupted or diluted. The canon they created represents their best efforts to preserve authentic apostolic teaching for future generations. This brings us to a crucial question that emerges from understanding the canonical process. If these texts gained their authority through careful community discernment, what does that mean for how we should approach them today? The answer requires us to consider not just the historical process of canonization, but the ongoing question of biblical authority and interpretation. The recognition that biblical authority emerged through human processes doesn't diminish that authority. It helps us understand its nature. Biblical authority isn't based on magical properties of the texts themselves, but on their authentic preservation of apostolic teaching and their continued power to guide Christian faith and practice. The canon represents the collective wisdom of early Christianity about which texts most faithfully convey the gospel message. This understanding has profound implications for contemporary biblical interpretation. It suggests that biblical authority is both historical and ongoing, rooted in the authentic preservation of apostolic teaching, but also demonstrated through the text's continued relevance and power. The canon provides a framework for reading these texts as authoritative, while recognizing their historical origins and contexts. The canonical process also established the principle that biblical interpretation should be communal rather than purely individual. Just as the canon emerged from the collective discernment of early Christian communities, biblical interpretation continues to benefit from the wisdom of believing communities. Individual insights are valuable, but they gain authority through their acceptance by the broader community of faith. Understanding the canonical process helps us navigate contemporary debates about biblical authority. Rather than treating these texts as magical documents that fell from heaven, we can appreciate them as the product of careful preservation and discernment by communities of believers. This understanding actually strengthens, rather than weakens, biblical authority by grounding it in historical reality. The formation of the biblical canon represents a remarkable achievement in preserving and transmitting religious truth. Early Christian communities developed sophisticated methods for evaluating texts, building consensus across diverse cultures, and establishing standards that have endured for centuries. Their work created the foundation for all subsequent Christian theology and practice. The canonical process also reveals the international and intercultural character of early Christianity. The texts that achieved canonical status had to gain acceptance across different regions, languages, and cultures. This cross-cultural validation provided additional confidence that these texts carried universal rather than merely local significance. Modern scholarship continues to enhance our understanding of the canonical process without undermining its significance. We now have better knowledge of the historical context in which these decisions were made, the criteria that guided them, and the communities that participated in them. This knowledge helps us appreciate the careful and thoughtful process by which the biblical canon was formed. The story of canon formation ultimately demonstrates the remarkable commitment of early Christian communities to preserving authentic apostolic teaching. They understood that the message of Jesus Christ was too important to be corrupted or lost. The canon they created represents their best efforts to ensure that this message would be preserved for future generations. As we consider the implications of this canonical process, we're reminded that biblical authority isn't based on blind faith, but on careful evaluation and historical validation. The texts that comprise the biblical canon earned their authority through centuries of testing in the crucible of Christian experience. They have proven their worth through their power to guide, inspire, and transform lives across cultures and centuries. The formation of the biblical canon also established principles that continue to guide biblical interpretation today. The recognition that these texts emerged from specific historical contexts while carrying universal significance provides a framework for understanding how ancient texts speak to contemporary situations. The canon preserves both the historical particularity and the universal relevance of apostolic teaching. Understanding the canonical process helps us appreciate the remarkable achievement of biblical preservation. The texts that survived this process weren't just copied and transmitted, they were treasured, studied, and lived. The canon created a framework for preservation that has maintained these texts across millennia, ensuring that each generation has access to authentic apostolic teaching. The canonical process reveals the profound respect early Christians had for the written word and for the message it conveyed. They understood that certain texts carried unique authority because they preserved authentic apostolic teaching about Jesus Christ. This understanding motivated their careful evaluation of texts and their commitment to preserving those that met their rigorous standards. As we reflect on this remarkable process of canon formation, we're struck by the wisdom and dedication of early Christian communities. They faced the enormous responsibility of determining which texts would guide the faith of future generations. The care and thoughtfulness they brought to this task created the foundation for all subsequent Christian theology and practice. The formation of the biblical canon represents one of the most significant intellectual and spiritual achievements in human history. It demonstrates the capacity of human communities to preserve and transmit their most important truths across time and culture. The canon they created continues to shape billions of lives today, providing guidance, inspiration, and hope to believers around the world. But there's another dimension to this story that's equally important: the question of how these canonized texts have been interpreted and applied across the centuries. Because having an established canon is one thing, understanding what it means and how it should guide contemporary life is another challenge entirely. And that challenge brings us face to face with some of the most profound questions about the nature of truth, authority, and interpretation. The question of biblical interpretation has sparked some of the most passionate debates in human history. Think about it. You have a collection of texts written by multiple authors across 15 centuries, preserved through countless generations, and canonized by early Christian communities. Now comes the ultimate challenge. What do these texts actually mean? How should they guide human behavior? And who has the authority to determine their correct interpretation? This isn't just an academic exercise. Wars have been fought over biblical interpretation. Empires have risen and fallen based on competing understandings of scriptural authority. The Protestant Reformation began with a fundamental disagreement about how biblical texts should be read and who had the right to interpret them. Even today, billions of people make life-altering decisions based on their understanding of what these ancient texts teach. The complexity of biblical interpretation becomes clear when you consider the layers involved. You're not just reading words on a page, you're engaging with texts that were written in ancient languages, reflecting ancient cultures, addressing ancient situations, yet somehow speaking to contemporary concerns. It's like trying to have a conversation across millennia, where every word carries the weight of cultural, historical, and theological significance. Consider the challenges facing any interpreter. The original texts were written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, languages that most modern readers don't understand. Even scholars who master these languages must grapple with the fact that words change meaning over time. A Greek word that meant one thing in the first century might carry different connotations today. Translation becomes not just a linguistic exercise, but a cultural bridge-building project. But the challenges go deeper than language. These texts emerged from cultures that were fundamentally different from our own. When Jesus spoke about shepherds, his audience immediately understood the reference because shepherding was a common occupation. When Paul wrote about slavery, he was addressing a social institution that was woven into the fabric of ancient society. Modern readers must constantly translate not just words, but entire cultural contexts. The historical development of biblical interpretation reveals fascinating patterns. In the early centuries of Christianity, different schools of interpretation emerged. The Alexandrian school, influenced by Greek philosophy, tended toward allegorical interpretation, seeing deeper spiritual meanings beneath the literal text. The Antiochene school emphasized historical and grammatical interpretation, focusing on what the texts would have meant to their original audiences. These different approaches weren't just academic preferences, they reflected fundamental disagreements about how divine revelation works. Does God speak primarily through the literal meaning of texts, or through deeper spiritual truths that require allegorical interpretation? Is the Bible a collection of historical documents that must be understood in their original contexts, or a timeless spiritual guide that speaks directly to contemporary situations? The medieval period saw the development of what became known as the fourfold sense of Scripture. Interpreters recognized four levels of meaning: the literal sense, which dealt with historical events; the allegorical sense, which revealed deeper spiritual truths; the moral sense, which provided ethical guidance; and the anagogical sense, which pointed toward eternal realities. This sophisticated interpretive framework allowed medieval scholars to find multiple layers of meaning in biblical texts. But this multiplication of interpretive methods also created problems. If texts could mean multiple things simultaneously, how could anyone determine which interpretation was correct? The medieval church developed elaborate systems of ecclesiastical authority to resolve interpretive disputes, but these systems often seem to prioritize institutional control over textual understanding. The Protestant Reformation represented a seismic shift in biblical interpretation. Reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin insisted that Scripture should be interpreted according to its plain sense, accessible to ordinary believers rather than reserved for ecclesiastical authorities. They developed the principle of sola scriptura, Scripture alone, arguing that the Bible should be the ultimate authority for Christian faith and practice. This democratization of biblical interpretation had revolutionary implications. It suggested that ordinary believers could read and understand biblical texts without requiring priestly mediation. It challenged the monopoly of institutional interpretation and opened the door for individual conscience to play a role in understanding divine revelation. The printing press made this democratic approach practically feasible by making biblical texts widely available. But the Protestant emphasis on individual interpretation also created new challenges. If every believer could interpret Scripture for themselves, how could communities maintain theological unity? The proliferation of Protestant denominations suggests that individual interpretation, while liberating, also tends toward fragmentation. The same texts that were supposed to provide clear guidance became sources of division. The Enlightenment brought new challenges to biblical interpretation. Scholars began applying historical and scientific methods to biblical texts, questioning traditional assumptions about authorship, dating, and historical accuracy. The development of historical criticism revolutionized biblical scholarship, but also created tensions with traditional faith commitments. These scholarly methods revealed the complexity of biblical composition in unprecedented detail. Source criticism identified multiple authors within individual books. Form criticism analyzed the oral traditions that preceded written texts. Redaction criticism examined how editors shaped final versions. Each method provided new insights, but also raised questions about the nature of biblical authority. The tension between scholarly analysis and religious faith became particularly acute in the 19th and 20th centuries. Liberal scholars embraced historical criticism as a tool for understanding biblical texts in their original contexts. Conservative scholars worried that these methods undermined biblical authority by treating sacred texts as merely human documents. This tension continues to shape biblical interpretation today. Some scholars approach biblical texts as historical documents to be analysed using the same methods applied to other ancient literature. Others insist that biblical texts require special interpretive methods because of their status as divine revelation. Still others seek middle ground, arguing that rigorous historical analysis can actually enhance rather than undermine faith. The development of new interpretive methods has accelerated in recent decades. Literary criticism focuses on the artistic and narrative dimensions of biblical texts. Sociological criticism examines the social contexts in which texts were written and first read. Feminist criticism highlights the experiences and perspectives of women in biblical times. Liberation theology reads biblical texts through the lens of social justice and concern for the oppressed. Each of these approaches contributes valuable insights while also raising questions about interpretive authority. If biblical texts can be read from multiple perspectives, each revealing different aspects of meaning, how do we determine which readings are most faithful to the original intent? How do we balance respect for historical context with the need for contemporary relevance? The question of interpretive authority remains contentious. Catholic tradition emphasizes the role of church teaching authority in guiding biblical interpretation. Protestant traditions generally affirm the principle of Scripture interpreting Scripture, allowing biblical texts to illuminate each other. Pentecostal and charismatic traditions emphasize the role of the Holy Spirit in guiding individual interpretation. These different approaches reflect deeper theological disagreements about the nature of divine revelation and human understanding. Does God speak primarily through institutional channels, through individual conscience, or through the collective wisdom of believing communities? How do we balance the authority of the text with the authority of interpreters? The globalization of Christianity has introduced new dimensions to biblical interpretation. As the faith has spread to non-Western cultures, new interpretive perspectives have emerged. African theologians read biblical texts through the lens of their own cultural experiences. Asian scholars bring insights from their philosophical traditions. Latin American liberation theologians emphasize themes of social justice and economic equality. These diverse perspectives have enriched biblical interpretation by revealing meanings that Western interpreters might miss. They've also raised questions about whether there can be a single, universal interpretation of biblical texts, or whether different cultural contexts necessarily produce different understandings. The digital age has democratized biblical interpretation in unprecedented ways. Online resources make scholarly tools available to ordinary readers. Social media allows interpreters to share insights across cultural and denominational boundaries. But digital access also multiplies the number of interpretive voices, making it even more challenging to evaluate competing claims. Modern translation projects continue to grapple with fundamental questions about how to render ancient texts in contemporary language. Should translations prioritize literal accuracy or readability? How should translators handle passages that reflect ancient cultural assumptions that modern readers might find troubling? Should translations attempt to preserve the male-centered language of ancient texts or adapt them for contemporary sensibilities? These translation decisions aren't just technical choices, they're interpretive acts that shape how millions of readers understand biblical texts. Every translation is also an interpretation, reflecting the translator's understanding of what the original text meant and how they should speak to contemporary audiences. The question of biblical authority continues to evolve as new challenges emerge. How should biblical texts be applied to ethical issues that the original authors never envisioned? How do we balance the authority of Scripture with insights from modern science, psychology, and social research? How do we maintain respect for biblical teaching while acknowledging that our understanding of these texts continues to develop? These questions don't have easy answers, but they reflect the ongoing vitality of biblical interpretation. Rather than being static documents whose meaning was fixed centuries ago, biblical texts continue to speak to new situations and challenges. The process of interpretation becomes itself a form of dialogue between ancient wisdom and contemporary insight. The diversity of interpretive approaches also reflects the richness of biblical texts themselves. These aren't simple documents with single meanings, but complex works that reward careful study and reflection. Different readers bring different questions and perspectives, discovering new dimensions of meaning that previous generations might have missed. But this diversity also creates responsibility. If biblical texts can be interpreted in multiple ways, then interpreters must be careful not to impose their own agendas on the texts. The goal of interpretation should be to hear what the texts are actually saying, not to make them say what we want them to say. The scholarly tools available to modern interpreters are more sophisticated than ever before. We have better knowledge of ancient languages, cultures, and historical contexts. We have access to thousands of manuscripts and archaeological discoveries. We can trace the development of interpretive traditions across centuries and cultures, yet these tools also reveal the complexity of interpretation. The more we know about ancient contexts, the more we realize how much we don't know. The more manuscripts we discover, the more we appreciate the challenges of textual transmission. The more interpretive traditions we study, the more we understand the difficulty of achieving consensus. This complexity shouldn't discourage interpretation, but should encourage humility. Biblical texts have survived and thrived for millennia, precisely because they continue to speak to new situations and challenges. The ongoing process of interpretation is itself a testament to their enduring relevance and power. The future of biblical interpretation will likely be shaped by continued archaeological discoveries, advances in linguistic analysis, and the emergence of new cultural perspectives. As Christianity continues to grow in the global South, new interpretive voices will emerge, bringing fresh insights to ancient texts. Technology will also play an increasing role in biblical interpretation. Digital tools allow scholars to analyze texts in unprecedented detail, tracing patterns and connections that would have been impossible to detect manually. Artificial intelligence might eventually assist in translation and interpretation, though human judgment will remain essential for understanding the deeper meanings of texts. The democratization of interpretive tools through digital technology will continue to empower ordinary readers, while also creating new challenges for evaluating interpretive claims. The abundance of interpretive resources available online means that readers must develop skills for evaluating the quality and reliability of different sources. But perhaps the most important development in biblical interpretation is the growing recognition that these texts are meant to be lived, not just studied. The ultimate test of any interpretation is whether it helps people live more faithfully, love more deeply, and serve more effectively. Biblical texts were written not just to inform, but to transform. This practical dimension of interpretation brings us back to the fundamental purpose of biblical texts. They weren't preserved across millennia merely to satisfy historical curiosity or provide material for scholarly debate. They were preserved because generations of believers found in them guidance for living, hope for the future, and insight into the deepest questions of human existence. The story of biblical interpretation is ultimately a story about the human search for meaning and truth. It reveals our capacity to engage with ancient wisdom while addressing contemporary challenges. It demonstrates both the possibilities and the limitations of human understanding. And it reminds us that the most important truths are often the most difficult to grasp. As we continue to interpret these ancient texts, we participate in a conversation that spans millennia. We join our voices to those of countless previous interpreters who have found in these texts a source of guidance, inspiration, and hope. And we contribute to a tradition that will continue long after we're gone, as future generations discover new meanings and applications for these enduring words. The challenge of biblical interpretation is also its gift. These texts refuse to be reduced to simple formulas or easy answers. They continue to surprise, challenge, and inspire readers who approach them with open minds and receptive hearts. The ongoing process of interpretation is itself a form of spiritual discipline, requiring patience, humility, and wisdom. In the end, the question of biblical interpretation returns us to the fundamental questions of human existence. How should we live? What can we hope for? How do we find meaning in a complex and often confusing world? Biblical texts don't provide simple answers to these questions, but they offer wisdom, guidance, and hope for those who engage with them seriously. The story of biblical interpretation reminds us that truth is not always simple or easy to grasp. It requires effort, community, and ongoing dialogue. But the rewards of this effort are immense. Those who engage seriously with biblical texts often find not just information, but transformation, not just knowledge, but wisdom, not just answers, but better questions. This brings us to perhaps the most important question of all. Why does any of this matter? Why should modern people care about ancient texts written in dead languages by people who lived in cultures vastly different from our own? The answer lies not just in the historical significance of these texts, but in their continuing power to speak to the deepest human concerns. The influence of biblical texts on human civilization cannot be overstated. These ancient writings have shaped legal systems, inspired artistic masterpieces, guided moral frameworks, and provided comfort to billions across millennia. But their impact extends far beyond religious communities. The Bible has influenced literature, philosophy, politics, and social movements in ways that continue to reverberate today. Consider the legal foundations of Western civilization, the concept of universal human rights, the principle of equality before the law, the idea that even rulers are subject to moral constraints. All of these can be traced back to biblical teachings. The Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, each draws upon biblical concepts of justice and human dignity. The abolition of slavery provides a powerful example of biblical influence on social change. While some used biblical texts to justify slavery, others found in the same text a compelling argument for human freedom. The Underground Railroad was organized largely by people who saw their work as obedience to biblical commands. Frederick Douglass learned to read from the Bible and found in it both the vocabulary and the moral framework for his fight against slavery. The civil rights movement of the 20th century was profoundly shaped by biblical themes. Martin Luther King Jr. drew upon biblical imagery of Exodus and Promised Land to articulate a vision of racial justice. His "I Have a Dream" speech is saturated with biblical language and concepts. The movement's commitment to non-violence reflected biblical teachings about love for enemies and the power of redemptive suffering. Women's suffrage movements also found inspiration in biblical texts. Leaders like Frances Willard and Susan B. Anthony argued that biblical principles of human dignity and spiritual equality supported women's political rights. They challenged traditional interpretations that had been used to exclude women from public life, offering alternative readings that emphasized women's full humanity and calling. The influence extends to literature and the arts. From Dante's Divine Comedy to Milton's Paradise Lost, from Handel's Messiah to Bach's Passion settings, biblical themes have inspired some of humanity's greatest artistic achievements. Modern literature continues to draw upon biblical narratives, characters, and themes even when authors don't share traditional religious beliefs. But perhaps most significantly, biblical texts have shaped how humans understand themselves and their place in the universe. The idea that individual human lives have inherent worth and dignity, that history is moving towards some ultimate purpose, that suffering can be redemptive. These concepts, now taken for granted in much of the world, emerged from biblical worldviews. The Bible's influence on language itself is profound. Phrases like the writing on the wall, a drop in the bucket, the powers that be, and the salt of the earth all derive from biblical texts. English literature is so saturated with biblical allusions that understanding these texts is essential for comprehending much of Western literary tradition. Modern psychology has also been shaped by biblical concepts. The idea of conscience, the understanding of guilt and forgiveness, the concept of hope in the face of suffering, all reflect biblical themes that have become part of how humans understand their inner lives. Even secular therapeutic approaches often draw upon insights that can be traced back to biblical wisdom. The Bible's influence on education is equally significant. The development of literacy in many cultures was driven by the desire to read sacred texts. Universities emerged from cathedral schools established to train clergy. The idea that education should be available to all people, regardless of social class, owes much to biblical principles of human dignity and worth. Political philosophy has been profoundly shaped by biblical concepts. The idea of limited government, the principle of separation of powers, the concept of natural law, all reflect biblical insights about human nature and the proper ordering of society. Even secular political theorists often draw upon frameworks that originated in biblical thought. The Bible's influence on scientific development is more complex but equally significant. While some have seen tension between biblical faith and scientific inquiry, many of history's greatest scientists were motivated by biblical beliefs about the orderliness of creation and the human calling to understand the natural world. The scientific revolution emerged in cultures shaped by biblical worldviews. Modern human rights movements continue to draw upon biblical themes. The struggle for economic justice, the fight against human trafficking, the movement for environmental protection, all find inspiration in biblical teachings about human dignity, social responsibility, and care for creation. Even secular human rights organizations often use language and concepts that derive from biblical sources. The Bible's influence on global development is profound. Christian missions, whatever their limitations, played crucial roles in establishing schools, hospitals, and social services around the world. The concept of humanitarian aid, the idea that wealthy nations have obligations to help the poor, the principle of international cooperation, all reflect biblical teachings about human solidarity and responsibility. But the Bible's influence isn't just historical. It continues to shape contemporary debates. Discussions about economic inequality, environmental responsibility, immigration policy, and social justice all involve competing interpretations of biblical principles. The texts continue to provide vocabulary and frameworks for addressing modern challenges. The global nature of biblical influence is particularly striking. These texts, originating in a small region of the ancient Middle East, have been translated into virtually every human language. They've been adapted to countless cultural contexts while maintaining their essential message. The Bible has become perhaps the most truly global text in human history. This global reach has also created new challenges and opportunities. As biblical texts encounter different cultures, they're interpreted through different lenses, revealing new dimensions of meaning. African theologians emphasize themes of liberation and community. Asian scholars highlight contemplative and mystical elements. Latin American interpreters focus on social justice and economic equality. The digital age has accelerated the Bible's global influence. Online resources make biblical texts available to people who might never have had access to them before. Social media allows interpreters from different cultures to share insights across traditional boundaries. Digital tools enable new forms of collaborative interpretation and study. But the Bible's influence also raises important questions about cultural imperialism and religious diversity. As these texts spread globally, they've sometimes displaced indigenous traditions and worldviews. The challenge is to appreciate the Bible's positive contributions while remaining sensitive to its potential for cultural domination. The Bible's influence on contemporary ethics is particularly significant. Issues like bioethics, environmental responsibility, artificial intelligence, and genetic engineering all require moral frameworks that can guide decision-making in unprecedented situations. Biblical principles of human dignity, stewardship, and social responsibility continue to provide resources for addressing these challenges. The texts also influence how people understand suffering and hope. In a world marked by tragedy and injustice, biblical narratives provide frameworks for making sense of pain while maintaining hope for the future. These aren't just theological concepts, but practical resources for navigating life's difficulties. The Bible's influence on community formation is equally important. These texts have provided the foundation for countless communities of mutual support, service, and care. From monastic communities to modern congregations, from charitable organizations to social movements, biblical principles have inspired people to create alternative ways of living together. The texts also influence how people understand time and history. The biblical vision of history as moving toward ultimate purpose and fulfillment has shaped Western concepts of progress and development. Even secular philosophies of history often reflect biblical patterns of thinking about time and change. The Bible's influence on individual psychology and spirituality remains profound. Millions of people find in these texts guidance for personal decision-making, comfort in times of difficulty, and inspiration for moral living. The texts provide frameworks for understanding identity, purpose, and meaning that continue to resonate across cultures and centuries. But this influence also creates responsibility. If biblical texts continue to shape human behavior and social structures, then how they're interpreted and applied matters enormously. The same texts that have inspired movements for justice and liberation have also been used to justify oppression and violence. The challenge is to read these texts in ways that honor their best insights while avoiding their potential for harm. The Bible's continuing influence suggests that these ancient texts touch something fundamental about human nature and experience. They address questions that every generation must face. How should we live? What can we hope for? How do we find meaning in suffering? What obligations do we have to others? These perennial questions ensure that biblical texts remain relevant regardless of changing circumstances. The global conversation about biblical interpretation is itself a form of influence. As people from different cultures and backgrounds engage with these texts, they create new forms of dialogue and understanding. The Bible becomes a meeting ground where different perspectives encounter each other, sometimes conflicting, but often enriching each other. The texts also influence how people understand the relationship between individual and community. Biblical emphasis on both personal responsibility and communal solidarity provides resources for addressing modern tensions between individual freedom and social obligation. These aren't just theological concepts, but practical frameworks for organizing society. The Bible's influence on concepts of forgiveness and reconciliation is particularly significant in a world marked by conflict and division. Biblical teachings about forgiveness have inspired truth and reconciliation processes in post-conflict societies. The texts provide frameworks for moving beyond cycles of revenge and retaliation. The influence extends to how people understand work and economic life. Biblical teachings about stewardship, justice, and care for the poor continue to shape debates about economic policy and business ethics. The texts provide resources for thinking about the proper relationship between wealth and responsibility. The Bible's influence on marriage and family life remains significant across cultures. While interpretations vary, the texts provide frameworks for understanding commitment, love, and mutual responsibility that continue to shape how people approach relationships. These influences extend beyond religious communities to affect broader cultural attitudes. The texts also influence how people understand leadership and authority. Biblical teachings about servant leadership, moral accountability, and responsibility to the common good provide alternatives to purely power-based models of leadership. These principles continue to influence political and organizational thinking. The Bible's influence on concepts of peace and conflict resolution is particularly relevant in our interconnected world. Biblical teachings about reconciliation, justice, and love for enemies provide resources for addressing international conflicts and social divisions. These aren't just idealistic concepts, but practical frameworks for building more peaceful societies. The continuing influence of biblical texts suggests that their significance extends far beyond their original historical contexts. They've become part of the cultural DNA of human civilization, shaping how people think about fundamental questions of existence, meaning, and morality. Understanding this influence is essential for understanding human culture itself. The Bible's influence also demonstrates the power of texts to transcend their original contexts and speak to new situations. These ancient writings continue to provide frameworks for addressing contemporary challenges, suggesting that human wisdom can bridge vast gaps of time and culture. The texts serve as a reminder that some insights are truly timeless, but the Bible's influence also reveals the importance of interpretation and application. The same texts that have inspired liberation movements have also been used to justify oppression. The difference lies not in the texts themselves, but in how they're read and applied. This places enormous responsibility on interpreters and communities to read these texts carefully and faithfully. The global nature of biblical influence also demonstrates the possibility of cross-cultural dialogue and understanding. Despite vast differences in culture, language, and historical context, people from around the world find meaning in these ancient texts. This suggests that human beings share common concerns and aspirations that transcend cultural boundaries. The Bible's continuing influence in the digital age raises new questions about accessibility and interpretation. As these texts become available to anyone with internet access, new forms of interpretation and application emerge. The challenge is to maintain the wisdom of traditional interpretation while remaining open to new insights and perspectives. The text's influence on social movements suggests that they contain resources for addressing contemporary challenges. Whether the issue is economic inequality, environmental degradation, or social injustice, biblical principles continue to provide frameworks for understanding and action. This relevance helps explain why these ancient texts remain influential in modern contexts. The Bible's influence on individual lives remains perhaps its most significant aspect. Millions of people find in these texts guidance for daily living, comfort in times of difficulty, and inspiration for moral action. This personal influence creates the foundation for the broader social and cultural influences we've discussed. The continuing dialogue about biblical interpretation is itself a form of influence. As scholars, believers, and critics engage with these texts, they create ongoing conversations about meaning, truth, and application. These conversations shape how the texts are understood and applied in new contexts. The Bible's influence reminds us that ideas have consequences. The concepts and principles contained in these texts have shaped human history in profound ways. Understanding this influence is essential for understanding how ideas spread, how cultures develop, and how texts can transcend their original contexts to speak to new situations. The global reach of biblical influence also demonstrates the power of translation and cultural adaptation. These texts have been successfully translated into hundreds of languages and adapted to countless cultural contexts. This suggests that some human insights are truly universal, capable of speaking across cultural boundaries. The Bible's continuing influence in secular contexts suggests that its insights extend beyond religious communities. The texts address fundamental human concerns that are relevant regardless of religious belief. This broader relevance helps explain why biblical themes continue to appear in literature, politics, and social movements. The influence of biblical texts on human civilization is ultimately a story about the power of words to shape reality. These ancient writings continue to influence how people think, feel, and act. They provide frameworks for understanding self and society that have endured across millennia. Understanding this influence is essential for understanding human culture itself. The Bible's influence also demonstrates the importance of preserving and transmitting cultural wisdom. The communities that preserved these texts across centuries understood that they contained insights worth maintaining for future generations. Their success in this preservation effort has made possible the continuing influence we see today. The ongoing dialogue about biblical interpretation suggests that these texts continue to offer new insights and applications. Rather than being static documents whose meaning was fixed long ago, they remain dynamic resources for addressing contemporary challenges. This ongoing relevance helps explain their enduring influence. The Bible's influence on concepts of hope and meaning provides particular significance in our current context. In a world often marked by despair and meaninglessness, these texts offer frameworks for understanding purpose and possibility. They remind us that human existence can have significance beyond immediate circumstances. The text's influence on social reform movements demonstrates their power to inspire change. From abolition to civil rights, from women's suffrage to economic justice, biblical principles have motivated people to work for social transformation. This transformative power continues to make these texts relevant to contemporary challenges. The Bible's global influence also creates opportunities for cross-cultural dialogue and understanding. As people from different backgrounds engage with these texts, they create new forms of conversation and mutual enrichment. The texts become a meeting ground where different perspectives can encounter and learn from each other. The continuing influence of biblical texts in the 21st century suggests that their significance extends far beyond their historical origins. They've become part of the ongoing human conversation about meaning, purpose, and responsibility. Understanding this influence is essential for understanding how cultures develop and how wisdom is transmitted across generations. The Bible's influence reminds us that some insights transcend their original contexts and continue to speak to new situations. These ancient texts address perennial human concerns that remain relevant regardless of changing circumstances. Their continuing influence demonstrates the possibility of wisdom that bridges vast gaps of time and culture. But this influence also creates responsibility. If these texts continue to shape human behavior and social structures, then how they're interpreted and applied matters enormously. The challenge is to read them in ways that honor their best insights while avoiding their potential for harm. This requires careful attention to both historical context and contemporary application. The story of biblical influence is ultimately a story about the human search for meaning and truth. It demonstrates our capacity to find in ancient texts resources for addressing contemporary challenges. It shows how ideas can spread across cultures and centuries, shaping human civilization in profound ways. As we consider the continuing influence of biblical texts, we're reminded that these ancient writings remain living documents, capable of speaking to new situations and challenges. Their influence isn't just historical, but ongoing, shaping how people understand themselves and their world. This continuing relevance suggests that the conversation about biblical meaning and application will continue as long as humans grapple with fundamental questions of existence and purpose. The Bible's influence on human civilization is both a historical fact and a continuing reality. These texts have shaped the past and continue to influence the present. Understanding this influence is essential for understanding human culture and for navigating the challenges of our contemporary world. The conversation about biblical meaning and application remains as relevant today as it was to the ancient communities that first preserved these texts. And perhaps that's the most profound truth of all. The Bible matters not because it's ancient, but because it's alive. Not because it's finished, but because it's ongoing. Not because it provides easy answers, but because it asks the right questions. Think about what we've discovered on this journey. We've seen how artificial intelligence can reveal the fingerprints of multiple authors in texts written millennia ago. We've watched archaeological discoveries validate historical accounts that skeptics once dismissed as myth. We've traced the careful process by which communities of believers preserved and transmitted these texts across centuries of upheaval and change. But most importantly, we've witnessed something that should take your breath away. Here are texts created by dozens of authors across 15 centuries, preserved by thousands of scribes, transmitted through countless copies, translated into hundreds of languages, and interpreted by billions of readers. By every logical measure, these texts should have been corrupted beyond recognition, diluted into meaninglessness, or forgotten entirely. Instead, they've maintained their essential message with remarkable consistency. They've spoken to every generation, every culture, every human condition. They've inspired the greatest achievements of human civilization while also being misused to justify its greatest failures. They've survived the fall of empires, the rise of new technologies, and the constant evolution of human thought. This isn't just preservation, this is transformation. These texts don't just survive, they adapt, speaking to new situations while maintaining their core truths. They're like a river that flows through changing landscapes, sometimes narrow and swift, sometimes broad and calm, but always moving, always alive, always finding new paths to the sea. The scholars who study these texts, the believers who find guidance in them, the critics who challenge them, the artists who draw inspiration from them, all are participating in an ongoing conversation that began in ancient Palestine and continues in universities, churches, and homes around the world. The Bible isn't just a book that was written, it's a conversation that continues to unfold, and that conversation is far from over. As new archaeological discoveries emerge, as new analytical techniques develop, as new voices join the dialogue, our understanding of these texts continues to evolve. The Bible that your grandparents read is the same Bible you might read today, but it's also different because each generation brings new questions, new insights, new challenges to the ancient words. This is why the Bible matters. Not because it's a museum piece from the ancient world, but because it's a living document that continues to speak. Not because it provides a comprehensive answer to every question, but because it offers a framework for thinking about the questions that matter most. Not because it eliminates mystery, but because it helps us live with mystery while still moving forward. The multiple authors who contributed to these texts, the scribes who preserved them, the communities that canonize them, the scholars who interpret them, all understood something that we sometimes forget in our digital age. Some truths are too important to be left to chance. Some wisdom is too valuable to be lost. Some conversations are too essential to be allowed to end. The Bible survived because people decided it was worth surviving. It thrived because communities chose to make it thrive. It speaks today because every generation has found in it something worth hearing. And it will continue to influence human civilization because the questions it addresses, how should we live? What can we hope for? How do we find meaning in suffering? Are questions that will never become obsolete. So the next time you encounter these ancient texts, remember the journey they've taken to reach you. Remember the scribes who copied them by flickering lamplight, the communities that debated which ones to preserve, the scholars who dedicated their lives to understanding them. Remember that you're not just reading words on a page, You're joining a conversation that spans millennia. Whether you approach these texts as a believer seeking guidance, a scholar pursuing knowledge, or simply a curious person wondering about the forces that shaped human civilization, you're participating in something larger than yourself. You're adding your voice to the ongoing dialogue about meaning, truth, and purpose that these texts have inspired for thousands of years. The Bible matters because it reminds us that human beings are storytelling creatures, that we find meaning through narrative, that we preserve what we value most in words passed down through generations. It matters because it shows us that some insights transcend their original contexts and continue to illuminate new situations. It matters because it demonstrates that communities can work together across time to preserve and transmit wisdom. But most of all, the Bible matters because it's still speaking, still challenging, still inspiring, still transforming. The conversation that began in ancient Palestine continues in every classroom where these texts are studied, every sanctuary where they're read, every heart where they're pondered. The story isn't over. The final chapter hasn't been written, because in the end, that's what the Bible really is. Not a finished product, but an ongoing conversation. Not a closed book, but an open invitation. Not the final word, but the beginning of a dialogue that will continue as long as human beings wonder about their place in the universe, their purpose in life, and their hope for the future. The ancient authors who first put stylus to parchment could never have imagined that their words would still be read, studied, and debated thousands of years later. They were writing for their own communities, addressing their own challenges, responding to their own questions. Yet somehow, their words transcended those original contexts to speak to every generation since. That's the miracle of the Bible. Not that it was written by divine dictation, but that it was created by human beings who touched something eternal. Not that it provides easy answers, but that it asks the questions that matter most. Not that it's perfect, but that it's profound. Not that it's simple, but that it's inexhaustible. The Bible matters because it reminds us that we're part of something larger than ourselves, part of a conversation that began before we were born and will continue after we're gone, part of a community that spans centuries and cultures, part of a story that's still being written, still unfolding, still discovering new chapters. And that's why understanding the Bible's history, who wrote it, how it was preserved, why it was canonized, how it's been interpreted, matters so much. Because when we understand the human processes that created and preserved these texts, we can better appreciate both their limitations and their power. We can read them with both critical intelligence and open hearts. We can join the conversation with both respect for the past and hope for the future. The Bible's history is humanity's history. Its preservation is our preservation. Its interpretation is our interpretation. Its influence is our influence. And its future depends on what we do with it next. So, as you continue your own journey of discovery, remember that you're not just learning about ancient texts. You're participating in the ongoing human quest for meaning, truth, and purpose. You're adding your voice to a conversation that has shaped the world and will continue to shape it for generations to come. The Bible matters because we matter. Because our questions matter. Because our search for truth and meaning matters. And because the conversation about these texts, the conversation you're now part of, will continue to matter as long as human beings wonder about the deepest questions of existence. The final chapter of the Bible's story hasn't been written yet. It's being written right now by every person who engages with these texts, every community that finds in them guidance for living, every generation that discovers in them new insights for old challenges. The story continues, the conversation goes on, and you're invited to be part of it.